When Queen Victoria ascended to the throne in 1837, London's sewers were already antiquated, crumbling to bits, and desperately lacked the capacity to manage the waste of an ever-expanding industrial metropolis. The amount of waste choked the tunnels and, in times of heavy rain, a filthy mix of sewage and rainwater would flood the streets and the basements of houses and pubs. Whether it overflowed or not, all this foul water eventually discharged into the River Thames. The smell was so bad that in the hot summer of 1858 it was called the Great Stink, and it took this overpowering stench to plague Westminster before politicians were finally forced into paying to reconstruct the decrepit sewerage system. Today, in an account by George Turnbull, a Victorian civil engineer, you will find out the history of London's toilet, how over many centuries the city sanitation consisted of little more than emptying stinking slops from houses straight into pits, where it was conveyed into court, alley and street to be washed by channels into the Thames. The filth, stench, disease and vermin must have been horrendous. It took until the 19th century for anything to improve, but local bureaucracy had to be overcome. There was no uniformity in sewer construction, because every district had different ideas how to deal with the sewage problem. Sewers were often of different sizes. Larger ones flowed into smaller ones, and you can imagine the horrific results. The sheer amount of sewage resulted in the Thames becoming no more than a stagnant, open sewer. You will discover how the dirt, disease, and smell was so bad that it took the almost unimaginable conditions of the Great Stink to conceive a massive civil engineering project, led by Sir Joeseph Bazalgette, to free Londoners from what had become a shocking, unsanitary nightmare. Before we move on, if you're interested in history like this, and you want to find out more about what life was really like for people in the past, please consider subscribing for more content. If you'd like to support what we make for you, check out the description for links to ways you can help us continue bringing the past alive. Centuries ago, when artificial drainage was first introduced, the sewers were made to follow the lines of those streams which, flowing into the Thames on each side, formed the natural drainage for this part of the river basin. But as London developed and the population increased, the discharge of a growing volume of sewage into the Thames constituted a serious danger to the health of the inhabitants, especially in view of the fact that the river was the principal source of their water supply. Cholera's lesson was slowly taken to heart. In 1865, a reform which had long been urgently required was carried out, and London was presented with a system of main drainage which became the admiration of the world. The principle of it is that of interception. Lines of conduits, laid at right angles to the sewers, receive the sewage and carry it in an easterly direction to points on the banks of the river sufficiently remote not to affect the health of London. At those points the sewage is discharged, and after chemical treatment the remaining sludge is carried in vessels 50 miles out to the open sea. The perfection of the sewage system was entirely a work of the 19th century. We may glance at the very different conditions which prevailed in London's younger days, before the construction of underground sewers was thought of. In the 12th century the inhabitants had a refuse pit attached to each dwelling, and the pits were emptied by nightmen, and the refuse conveyed to lay stalls at Dowgate, Whitefriars, or other points. The street sloped down to a channel in the centre, which carried off the rainwater and most of the slops. The citizens were required to keep clean the pavement and channels in front of their dwellings, and the filth swept up was removed by a class of men called rakers, who placed it in carts. A great many latrines overhung the river. The master of the temple was bound to keep up one for public gratuitous use. The little stream called the Walbrook was literally lined by one long street of these devices, for which the public each paid £1 a year. There was also a public convenience in Moorfields. In 1307, a commission of sewers was created to purify the River Fleet, the exhalations from which had been strong enough to overcome the incense burnt at the altars in neighbouring churches. This river, indeed, became inaccessible for ships on account of the accumulation of filth. Other statutes of a local nature were made in 1225, 1436, 1438, 1489, and in 1515, under which the conditions for executing drainage works were partially regulated. But no measure of a general character was passed until 1531. This was renewed in 1548, and in 1607 James I extended its application so as to include all places within 2 miles of London. In 1732, the River Fleet was covered in and formed into a sewer behind Holborn. The Ranelagh, the River Westbourne, a tributary of the Thames, now culverted, and the King's Scholars Pond sewers, the River Tyburn, and other important arterial drains were closed in about the same period. At the beginning of the 19th century, the sewers, which discharged into the Thames, were still permitted to be used only for the purpose of carrying off the surface or rainwater. To cast any house drainage or other offensive matter into them was a penal offence. All offensive house refuse was collected into cesspools, the contents of which were removed from time to time and carted away for use in the country. There was generally, behind every house, a small yard or garden, at the end of which stood the privy over a cesspool. An important advance in general cleanliness and sanitation was marked by the introduction of water closets to the houses in the year 1810. Although it was slow to be adopted at first, the advantages of this invention were gradually recognised, and in the course of 20 years, water closets were in fairly general use. Originally, they were made to discharge into the cesspools, and the large addition this formed to the contents of the latter rendered necessary the laying of overflow drains from them, running into the street sewers. As London grew and cesspools multiplied, they were found to be sources of annoyance, and where badly constructed, they were often fruitful breeding places of disease. Water closets, on the other hand, presented new facilities for effective and immediate removal of sewage, and the practice was introduced of discharging it, with the aid of a now improved water supply, into the street drains, whence it was conducted to the Thames. But soon a serious complication arose. The river was becoming dangerously impure. At this period, 1834, there were 7 boards of commissioners of sewers, existing within a circle of 10 miles from the post office. These boards had to deal only with rainwater from the streets, the open grounds, and the roofs of houses. There was no uniformity in the action of the boards. Publicity was utterly unknown in their affairs. There was no rigidly enforced code of responsibility. Rates might be equal, while the advantages reaped by the ratepayers were widely at variance. A citizen, having property in Finsbury, Westminster, and the City, might find himself subject to a penalty for acting in any 2 of these divisions in the same manner as he had acted in the 3rd. Nor was a man compelled to drain his house. Sewer rates were exacted from all, but no inhabitant could make a connection with a sewer unless he paid the sum of 17 shillings 6pence. The death rate reflected the unhealthy conditions of life. In 1838, 1839 and 1840, the average annual rate was 37.38 per 1,000 of the population, and in certain congested districts it was over 60 per 1,000. An illustration of inconvenience arising from the absence of a common understanding among the authorities occurred in the City, through which it was necessary for part of the Holborn and Finsbury sewage to pass on its way to the river. The Holborn and Finsbury sewers had been greatly enlarged, and the City sewers were unequal to the task of carrying off their contents. The result was that houses in the vicinity of the river were inundated every time there was a fall of rain, the contents of their drains, in addition to the waters from the highlands and the neighbouring division, being forced back into the houses by the volume of water that occupied the main sewer. Neither Cheapside nor Leadenhall Street was sewered at this time. These routes formed the highest ground, and for excrementitious matter they possessed cesspools, which were dug through the clay or loam down to the gravel, allowing the whole of the fluids to percolate into the earth and probably contaminate the water supply. The idea of a system of intercepting sewers was first suggested in 1834 by Mr. John Martin, a painter of some distinction, who took active interest in water supply and drainage. His proposal was that both sides of the Thames should be embanked, and an intercepting sewer constructed in each embankment for the purpose of collecting the sewage and conveying it to points in the river below the most populous area. But although the inhabitants, by the cholera epidemic of 2 years before, had recognized the harmful effect of the existing system of sewage disposal upon the health of the community, they were not yet educated up to the acceptance of Martin's plan, which fell in face of the strong opposition it encountered. No advance towards unifying the medley of sewage authorities was made until the year 1848. The force of public feeling on the question led eventually to an Act being passed on the 4th of September 1848, by which the whole of the authorities, with the exception of the city, were united into one board, called the Consolidated Commission of Sewers. Every house was now required by the Act to be provided with a proper water closet or privy, and to be drained into the main sewers. The commissioners therefore set themselves to abolish the cesspools, of which there were still 200,000 in existence, and to introduce pipe sewer communications between the houses and the main drains, water closets being now established in all the houses. The waste products were conveyed by the sewers into the Thames, the Lee, and the Ravensbourne, and the great waterway in the heart of London thus became a huge open sewer. As the tide rose, it closed the outlets in many places and poured back the sewage flowing from high ground, which then accumulated in low-lying portions of the sewers, and remained there stagnant during the greater part of the day, often for 18 out of the 24 hours. During stagnation, moreover, the heavier ingredients fell to the bottom, and from day to day accumulated in the sewers. Lighter refuse was carried upriver on the rising tide, and churned back again to the city with the ebb. And this state of affairs was soon rendered still worse by the receipt of refuse from districts in the upper reaches of the river. When the town of Richmond wished to carry its sewage to the old Deer Park, which was a Crown possession, the Crown authorities objected, and the Commission forthwith conveyed the sewage to the Thames. Their example was followed by Twickenham, Isleworth, Kew, Brentford, and other communities outside the jurisdiction of the Commission. The commissioners who held office in 1849, a year marked by another epidemic of cholera, proposed that the sewage should be kept out of the Thames altogether, and that lines of sewers should be laid down which would converge into large tanks or sumps, from which the sewage could be pumped up and carried away for agricultural purposes. On the other hand, Mr. Phillips, the chief surveyor, recommended an extension of the proposed intercepting system for discharging the sewage into the river below London. The commissioners were unable to decide which of these schemes to adopt, and finally they advertised for competitive plans for a complete systematic drainage of the metropolis. No fewer than 116 designs were received in response to this invitation. The commissioners, finding themselves unable to agree upon any one, resigned office. Their successors continued the examination of the plans and were attracted by one in which Messrs. Maclean and Stileman, adopting the principle of interception, proposed carrying the outfalls to the sea and using the sewage to reclaim wastelands on the Essex coast. The commissioners, however, among whom at this time was Mr. Robert Stevenson, decided to prepare a scheme of their own, and plans were accordingly drawn up for them by Mr. Forster, who had long been one of Mr. Stevenson's most able railway assistants. This gentleman proposed to drain the south side of the metropolis by forming an intercepting sewer, to which the sewage would be raised by pumping, the physical configuration of this part of London making it impossible that any of it would flow away by gravitation. A reservoir at Woolwich Marshes was to receive the sewage during the intervals of the tides, and it was to be discharged into the river at the top of Woolwich Reach, 8 miles below London Bridge. The people were becoming exasperated. Even the commissioners themselves realised that they were not competent to deal with the subject. Cholera again breaking out, the government awoke to grapple with the difficulty. "I was determined," said Sir Benjamin Hall, the first Commissioner of Works, to whom the reform now introduced was directly due, "on the merciful abatement of the epidemic that ravaged the metropolis, to turn my attention to the state of this vast city. I knew that unless great and speedy radical changes in the constitution of its local affairs were effected, it was utterly hopeless to expect that those affairs would be well conducted. The Metropolitan Management Act, 1855, was then passed, which created the Metropolitan Board of Works, a central authority holding jurisdiction over local bodies and district boards. A plan for new main sewers was prepared by the board's engineer, Mr. afterwards Sir Joeseph Bazalgette, based on the scheme of Mr. Forster, who had died during the period of recrimination. Barking Creek on the north and Plumstead Marshes on the south were proposed as the points of outfall for the sewage. The necessity for government sanction was dispensed with by an Act of Parliament on the 2nd of August 1858, and thus the last obstacle was removed and the board were free to proceed with the work. That it was urgently required was evidenced by the stench from the river, which pervaded the Houses of Parliament in hot weather. The pent-up refuse which was deposited in the sewers entailed upon the board an annual expense of about £30,000 to flush the filth into the river. In summer months, £900 per week had been spent on disinfectants in order to keep down the stench and prevent plague. The scheme now carried out provided for the removal of 11,500,000 cubic feet of sewage per day on the north side of the Thames and 5,750,000 on the south side. The removal of a rainfall of 28,500,000 cubic feet per day on the north and 17,500,000 on the south. The relief of the low-lying districts from the effects of ordinary floods and tide locking. The delivery of the sewage and rain flow at points on the river where they should not be injurious to the health of the inhabitants or prejudicial to navigation. Facilities for treating the sewage chemically with a view to its disinfection before admitting it to the river, and for discharging the sewage at the most desirable period of the tide and securing its transmission in an innocuous condition to the sea.